Now that we added some data into our database in the last lecture, let's come back to that JSON thing. Because actually, MongoDB does not use JSON but BSON, which stands for binary JSON, for storing data in your database. Now, you don't really need to care too much about that because all you will write and see will be JSON code, like we did it. So this is JSON code, this is what we used in the last lecture, this is also what we see when we retrieve data from MongoDB, but behind the scenes, MongoDB actually uses BSON data. This conversion is done by the drivers. So this basically takes your JSON code and stores it in binary data. And this is simply done because, for one, it is more efficient to store than JSON data. So it's faster and more efficient from a space, from a size perspective. And additionally, it supports additional types. Because, for example, that object ID thing we saw in the last lecture is not valid normal JSON. If I were to go into my editor, which is Visual Studio Code, which you don't need, but this is simply an editor you can use for coding, and I would manually add an ID field here and set this equal to type object ID with some text in there, you see that my editor doesn't like this because it's not valid JSON. Now, it is not valid JSON, but MongoDB can actually understand and take this and store it in its binary data. And there are some other types too, like for example, you got different types of numbers with decimals and very big numbers, and these are stored in different ways behind the scenes. You don't need to care too much about that, but this is something MongoDB offers you. This special data type, other special data types, and very efficient storage in general. We will always work with our data like this though, so in JSON format. And there's one other important thing you need to understand about this data. If I add another piece of information into flight data with insert 1, so if I add another document, and this time I'll type it manually, when adding data like this, you can actually omit the quotation marks here as long as there is no white space in the name. So we could also have departure airport like this, and this would still be accepted. So I don't need to wrap the name into quotation marks here. You can still do it to be very clear that this is JSON, but well, we know it's JSON and you can use it like this as a shortcut. The value, if it's a string, still needs to be enclosed in double quotation marks though. So if we had Berlin Tegel as an airport here, and then let's say we have the arrival airport, which is Heathrow, then we could write it like this. We can now also theoretically save it like this, even though the aircraft distance and the information whether this is an intercontinental flight is missing, because you can have mixed documents in the same collection. If you add the data like this, you still see this is accepted. And if I now access all my flight data and find it and pretty print it, you see both documents exist in there, even though they have different schemas. Now we'll dive a bit deeper into schema design and how we should structure our data in a separate module, but I also want you to take away and keep in mind that in MongoDB, two documents in the same collection don't have to have the same schema. Often you will have at least some intersections or completely equal schemas, but it's not a must. One other thing you have to know is that this ID, which is auto-generated, you don't have to use the auto-generated ID, you just have to ensure that you have a unique ID. But if you can ensure this, you can also assign IDs on your own. So if I add the same entry again with departure airport and arrival airport, I can add underscore ID in there as an extra field, and it has to be underscore ID, so not just ID, also not ID with a capital character, underscore ID like this, and then you can use any ID you want, a number or another string, like Tixel LHR1. This can be done, and you see this was also accepted and inserted with this ID. So if I again print all the results here, you see we got our two old results and this new one does now not have an object ID, which was generated for us by MongoDB, but our own ID. If I try to enter the same entry again with the same ID though, and that's the only thing which is the problem here, not the other data. The other data maybe equal, as you can see here. But if I use the same idea again, we get an error. And in the end, this error is simply telling us that we get a duplicate key error in this collection and that the duplicate key is the ID, which is not allowed. So this is the error we're seeing here, and this is something you should also pay close attention to.